When developing the MultiMod, we had to do a fair bit of reorienting over time in terms of how to think about what it's doing. On the one hand, it's doing something very immediate and lively, since 8 outputs are all potentially running at their own rates, changing speed and direction independently, making it easy to create many signals from one and have intuitive control over all of them. On the other hand, there comes a time when you want to understand specifics about what the module is doing, why it does things, and when. As we discussed some prior to the MultiMod's launch, a lot of the language we have for speaking about the deeper functions of musical instruments, and electronic instruments in particular, is speaking in metaphor. Oscilloscope traces, for example, are a visual representation of something that's actually happening in some combination of electronic traces and currents of air. We generate this visual metaphor in order to pin down what is happening, capture and replay these moments with great precision so that it becomes legible to us through our eyes. Are the eyes the best path to understand something that is primarily received through the ears? There are many such metaphors available to us. For example, we've also used the metaphor of tape loops and delays to describe the functions of morphogene and mimeophone, which, of course, are modules that do not actually contain tape. Similarly, with the MultiMod, there are certain things it has in common with tape delays and buffers. And when we were developing the concept, at first we initially gravitated toward the well-known metaphors of buffers, read and write heads, and so forth. But of course, we quickly found that when utilizing these types of processes for control voltage, the metaphor feels different. Our pre-existing knowledge of how delays work with audio even starts to get in the way in a little bit. Summing CV signals together, for example, does not sound like a mix the way it does when you sum audio signals together. And with the different channels being able to be at a whole bunch of different points within a copy at any time, while it is also being continually overwritten at a different rate, it became kind of unwieldy to think of it this way. It was around this time when my coworker Mark suggested a different metaphor, that of orbits. It could be orbiting planets, runners on a track, a model of subatomic particles, whatever works for you. Bones took the planets version of this pretty literally, sitting in a spaceship and using a MultiMod-based panel to generate and control an entire solar system. Now, I like orbits for any number of reasons. Orbit DVD is the name of a terrific local video store here in Asheville. Orbits is also the name of the opening track on what is maybe my favorite jazz album, Miles Smiles. It's an infinitely beguiling Wayne Shorter tune and well-titled, with all the melodic instruments dancing in elliptical loops around the space-time warping sun of Tony Williams' drumming. Anyway, what I ended up with for my own mental model of the MultiMod was sort of a hybrid of the model of a solar system and the rotating line display on a sonar or radar device. If we consider a circle with 8 objects revolving around the center, orbiting, if you will, the full 360 degrees of the circle represents the entirety of the signal that is copied by MultiMod. And the time setting determines how much time that 360 degrees represents. We can visualize the movement of time by adding a rotating line, as you might see on a PPI radar display representing a rotating antenna. As the line rotates, it overwrites the portion of the circle that it rotates into, copying new material from the signal input as it goes. The amount of time it takes to rotate once around the circle is determined by, you guessed it, the time control. The channels, meanwhile, are also orbiting the center, reading from this copied signal as they go. If the spread control is at 12 o'clock, then they all orbit exactly at the same speed as the rotating line. When spread is turned clockwise from center, channels 1 to 4 will start to speed up, while channels 5 through 8 slow down. Now the channels are orbiting at different speeds from each other, as well as at a different speed from the rotating signal copying line. Faster, greener channels will often overtake the line. orbiting multiple times through the same copied material before it is overwritten anew. Meanwhile, slower, bluer channels will often be overtaken by the line. Depending on the material at the input, the moment where the channel crosses or is crossed by the line may create a discontinuity in the signal. When spread is turned counterclockwise from 12 o'clock, the channels change speed in the opposite fashion. Channels 5 through 8 speed up, while channels 1 through 4 go slower. In either direction, spread will have the greatest effect on the outermost channels, 1 and 8, and the least effect on the innermost channels, 4 and 5. The phase control determines the starting point, or new year, of each channel's orbit. Again, with spread at 12 o'clock, the channels all orbit at the same speed. If they were previously spread apart, they'll probably all be at different parts of the orbit. Unlike a real-life solar system, the channels of MultiMod are able to take many possible paths through their orbits, path being chosen by the shape button. The explanation so far assumes that the MultiMod is using the default shape, ramp. This shape causes the orbits to go at a constant speed, straight through the orbit in the same path taken by that signal copying line. We can visualize this by putting degrees of rotation on the vertical axis and the channel's position on the horizontal. The next shape, saw, causes the channels to orbit backwards. The result of the channel outputs is that the copied signals are read in reverse. Triangle shape has them orbit forward, then backward. Ditto for the side shape, but here they slow down as they approach the new year, then change direction and speed back up as they move away from it. A planeting orbiting forward, then backward exactly once per revolution would already strain the normal bounds of Newtonian physics and probably wreak havoc on the normal operation of its gravitational pull, but the last few shapes on the MultiMod go even farther, resulting in orbits with impossible motions, namely teleportation. The staircase, stepped random, and ramplets shape all involve discontinuous leaps. In fact, I sometimes find that because these shapes are almost made of discontinuities, any individual discontinuities tend to be less noticeable. The random and ramplets shapes also have the interesting property of jumping only to specific multiples of the overall time when the clock input is in use. This can lead to some interesting patch experiments if we take the time to hold this multi-level abstraction in our heads, but that may need to be saved for a different video. Visual metaphors for non-visual processes have their uses and their limits. I've found this orbits metaphor enlightening and inspiring, while also realizing that it can't be a full substitute for musical intuition. But at the same time, it can help to develop that intuition in a purposeful manner. I hope you also find it useful when patching MultiMod. Thanks for patching, and happy imagining.